The sound of waves crashing against the shore had always been my escape. For years I had imagined moments like this, lounging on a sun-drenched beach, a cocktail in hand, surrounded by the warmth of my closest friends. It was meant to be a dream vacation, a break from the daily grind, a way to reconnect with life, with laughter, and most importantly, with my husband, Mark. I remember the moment so clearly, the one that shattered it all. We were sitting on the balcony of our villa, the moon casting silver trails across the water. Everyone else had gone to bed, leaving us alone with the quiet night and the weight of too many drinks. Mark looked restless, his fingers tapping nervously against his glass. At first, I thought it was the tequila or the exhaustion, but then he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "I need to tell you something," he began, his voice strained, almost breaking. My stomach tightened. "What is it?" I asked, my tone steady but apprehensive. He exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. "Last night, I made a mistake. A huge mistake." I stared at him, the words hanging between us like an invisible knife. "What kind of mistake?" I managed, though my voice cracked under the weight of fear. "I slept with someone," he admitted, his words cutting through me like glass. "It was a stupid, meaningless thing, just a moment, nothing more." The world seemed to tilt. The rhythmic crash of the waves below became deafening, drowning out the sound of my own breath. I couldn't process what he was saying. I couldn't reconcile the man I had known, the man I trusted, with the person confessing this betrayal. "You what?" I whispered, my voice trembling. I could feel the hot sting of tears rising, but I refused to let them fall. Not yet. I needed answers. I needed this to make sense. Mark's face crumpled, guilt etched into every line. "It didn't mean anything," he repeated, as if those words could absolve him. "It was just the atmosphere, the drinks, the party. Everything got out of hand. I don't even know her name." His words only made it worse. The anonymity of it, the sheer carelessness, made my chest ache in ways I hadn't thought possible. This wasn't just a betrayal of my trust. It was a betrayal of everything we had built together. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I snapped, my voice rising. "Do you even understand what this means?" I know," he said, his hands raised as if to ward off the storm he had unleashed. "I wasn't thinking. It was a stupid, impulsive thing. I love you, not her. It was just a mistake." The word mistake felt like poison. How could he reduce something so devastating, so personal, to a single word? A mistake was forgetting an anniversary or breaking a dish, not ripping the foundation of our marriage apart. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the wooden deck. My heart was pounding, each beat a painful reminder of what I had just heard. "You expect me to just what? Forgive you? Pretend this never happened?" "No," he said quickly, desperation creeping into his voice. "I don't expect anything. I had to tell you. I couldn't keep it a secret." I wanted to scream, to throw something, to run. But instead I just stood there, staring at the man I had loved for over a decade, now a stranger to me. I thought of the years we had shared, the promises we had made, the life we had built together. And now all of it felt tainted like a cruel joke. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached for me, but I stepped back, the distance between us suddenly feeling insurmountable. "Please," he said, his voice breaking. "We can work through this. I'll do anything. I'll prove to you that this doesn't have to define us." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that we could somehow salvage what was left, that this didn't have to be the end. But the pain was too raw, too overwhelming. The image of him with someone else, the thought of his hands on another woman, was burned into my mind. "I need time," I said finally, the words heavy with exhaustion. "I can't even look at you right now." He nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Take all the time you need. Just, please don't give up on us." I didn't respond. I turned and walked back into the villa, the door closing softly behind me. In the darkness of our shared room, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, sadness, disbelief, and somewhere deep down the faintest flicker of hope. The vacation we had planned as a celebration of life and love had turned into something unrecognizable. The turquoise waters and golden sands now felt like a cruel backdrop to my pain. I didn't know what the future held for us. I didn't know if I could ever forgive him, let alone trust him again. But as I sat there, the first rays of dawn breaking through the curtains, I realized one thing. This was a crossroads. Whether we stayed together or fell apart, nothing would ever be the same. The following days passed in a haze, each moment dragging under the weight of Mark's confession. The villa, once filled with laughter and the easy camaraderie of friends, now felt suffocating, the air thick with tension only I seemed to notice. I moved through the days on autopilot, smiling when I had to, laughing when expected, but inside I was a hollow version of myself. Every glance at Mark sent a fresh wave of anger crashing over me, the memory of his words replaying endlessly in my mind. It didn't mean anything. But how could it not? How could he betray me so deeply and still claim it was meaningless? Mark tried in his way to make amends. He lingered near me at every opportunity, his touch hesitant, his words careful. At meals, he'd refill my glass without asking, and his gaze would linger on me, heavy with regret. First, I didn't let him get close. I couldn't. Every time he reached for me, I'd pull away, the hurt too raw, the wound too fresh. I saw the sadness in his eyes each time, but I couldn't bring myself to care. Sadness was a consequence of his choices. It wasn't my job to ease his guilt. Our friends, blissfully unaware, continued to bask in the carefree joy of the vacation. They joked, they drank, they danced under the stars, oblivious to the storm raging within me. There were moments when I thought about telling someone, pulling one of them aside and unloading the truth just to get the weight off my chest. But then what? Their pity? Their awkward attempts at comfort? No. This was mine to carry, and mine alone. On the fourth day, I found myself wandering down the beach alone. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, the kind of beauty that should have felt soothing. Instead, it felt mocking. I sat on the sand, the grains cool beneath my palms, and stared at the horizon, trying to make sense of it all. I thought about the years we'd spent together, the life we'd built. Mark had been my anchor, my partner, my everything. I had trusted him completely, and he had thrown it away in a single night. A single night with a nameless stranger. The thought made my stomach churn. I didn't hear him approach at first. His voice startled me, soft and tentative. "Do you want some company?" I turned to see Mark standing a few feet away, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his expression unreadable. Part of me wanted to tell him to go away, to leave me alone with my thoughts. But another part, quieter and more vulnerable, wanted answers. So I nodded. He sat down beside me, careful to leave a small gap between us. For a while, neither of us spoke. The sound of the waves filled the silence, a rhythmic reminder of the ebb and flow of life. Finally, he broke the quiet. "I know I've hurt you," he said, his voice barely audible over the crash of the surf. "And I know there's nothing I can say to fix it. But I need you to know how sorry I am." I didn't respond. What could I say? Sorry wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Still, I found myself asking the question that had been gnawing at me since his confession. Why? My voice was calm, but the word carried all the pain and confusion I felt. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "That's the truth. It was stupid and reckless and selfish. I wasn't thinking. I let the moment get the better of me, and I hate myself for it." "That's not an answer," I said sharply, my anger bubbling to the surface. "You don't just let the moment get the better of you when you're married. You make a choice, Mark. You chose to betray me." He flinched at my words, but he didn't argue. "You're right," he said after a long pause. "I did choose. And it was the worst choice I've ever made." I looked at him, then really looked at him. His shoulders were slumped, his face drawn with exhaustion and guilt. He looked like a man on the verge of breaking, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I felt a pang of something almost like sympathy. But it passed as quickly as it came. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know if I'll ever trust you again." "I understand," he said quietly. "But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn back your trust if you'll let me." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, but it wasn't enough to extinguish the anger and hurt burning inside me. I stood abruptly, brushing the sand from my hands. "I need time," I said, echoing the words I had spoken that first night. "I need to figure out what I want. What I need." He nodded. His eyes filled with sadness but also something else, hope. "Take all the time you need," he said softly. "I'll be here." I walked away without looking back, my thoughts swirling like a storm. Could I forgive him? Did I even want to? The answers didn't come easily, and as the days stretched into nights, I realized they might never come. But one thing was certain. The life I had known, the life I had trusted, was gone. And whether I stayed with Mark or walked away, I would have to rebuild myself from the pieces he had left behind. The rest of the trip became a slow, agonizing blur. Mark's presence was a constant reminder of what had been broken between us, and every smile he forced, every attempt to bridge the growing chasm, only deepened my resentment. My friends began to notice the shift, asking if everything was okay, their well-meaning concern like salt on an open wound. I lied, of course. What else could I do? I wasn't ready to share the truth, not when I hadn't even begun to understand it myself. On the last night of our stay, there was a party at the beach. A bonfire under the stars with music, food, and drinks flowing freely. Everyone was dressed in their vacation best, glowing with the freedom of one last evening in paradise. I almost didn't go. The thought of standing in the middle of that crowd, pretending to be okay while Mark lingered nearby, felt unbearable. But something about sitting alone in the villa felt worse, like I'd already surrendered to the sadness threatening to consume me. So I went, wrapping myself in a flimsy dress and a mask of indifference, determined to feel something other than pain. The party was exactly as I'd expected. Loud, carefree, and full of energy. The others danced, laughed, and swayed to the beat of the music, their joy a sharp contrast to the turmoil in my chest. I stayed near the edges, nursing a drink and watching the firelight flicker against the waves. Mark was there too, but he kept his distance, as if sensing that any attempt to approach me would push me further away. I caught his gaze once or twice, his eyes heavy with a mix of regret and longing, but I looked away each time, unwilling to let him see how much I was still hurting. As the night wore on, I found myself wandering away from the crowd, drawn to the quiet solitude of the shoreline. The music faded into the background, replaced by the soothing rhythm of the waves lapping against the sand. For the first time in days, I felt a sliver of peace, a momentary reprieve from the storm raging inside me. I stood there for what felt like hours, letting the cool breeze wash over me, when I heard a voice behind me. "You look like you could use some company," it said, soft and unfamiliar. I turned to see a man standing a few feet away, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his linen pants. He was tall and sun-kissed, his hair tousled from the wind, and his smile was easy, disarming. I recognized him vaguely, one of the other tourists staying nearby, someone I'd seen in passing but never spoken to. "Doi?" I asked, my tone more guarded than I intended. He shrugged, stepping closer but keeping a respectful distance. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just projecting. I've been looking for an excuse to escape that party for an hour." Despite myself, I smiled. There was something about his presence, his calm energy, that felt like a balm to my frayed nerves. "It is a bit much," I admitted, turning back to face the water. We stood in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that felt strangely comfortable. Finally, he spoke again. "I'm James, by the way." "Anna," I replied, glancing at him briefly. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "So, Anna, what's got you hiding out here instead of enjoying the festivities?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I considered brushing it off, offering some vague excuse about needing fresh air. But something about his tone, the genuine curiosity in his voice, made me hesitate. He didn't know me. He didn't know Mark. There was no judgment, no expectation. Just a stranger asking a question. "It's complicated," I said finally, the words feeling inadequate but true. James chuckled softly. "Isn't it always?" That made me smile again, a real smile this time, and for a brief moment, I felt the tightness in my chest ease. We started talking about nothing, really. The kind of aimless, meandering conversation you can only have with someone you'll likely never see again. He told me about his work, his travels, the places he'd been and the places he still wanted to go. I told him bits and pieces about myself, careful to skirt around the subject of Mark and the reason I was standing on this beach alone. As the hours passed, I found myself relaxing, the weight of my pain less suffocating in his presence. James had a way of making the world feel lighter, his easy laughter and kind eyes a temporary refuge from the chaos in my heart. It wasn't until the moon was high in the sky that I realized how late it had gotten. I should probably head back, I said reluctantly, the thought of returning to the villa filling me with a mix of dread and resignation. James nodded but didn't move. Before you go, he said, his tone serious now, can I just say something? I hesitated, then nodded. Whatever it is that's weighing you down, he began, his gaze steady. It doesn't define you. You seem like someone who carries a lot on her shoulders, but you don't have to. Sometimes it's okay to let go, even just for a little while. His words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment I couldn't speak. I didn't know how he'd seen through me so easily, how he'd managed to articulate something I hadn't even admitted to myself. All I could do was nod, my throat tight with emotion. Thank you, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, a soft, knowing smile. Take care, Anna. I turned and walked away, my mind swirling with everything he'd said. When I reached the villa, the party had died down, and the others were scattered, either asleep or too drunk to notice my return. Mark was sitting on the balcony, his head in his hands, looking as lost as I felt. I paused for a moment, watching him, my emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite name. I didn't approach him. Not yet. Instead, I slipped quietly into the bedroom, closing the door behind me. Lying there in the darkness, I thought about James's words, about the weight I'd been carrying and whether I was ready to let it go. Sleep didn't come easily, but when it did, it was the first time in days I didn't dream of the betrayal. Instead, I dreamed of the ocean, of waves washing away footprints in the sand, leaving a clean slate behind. The next morning came slowly, the warm light of dawn creeping into the villa and waking me far earlier than I'd hoped. For a long time I lay there staring at the ceiling, letting the events of the past week cycle through my mind. The betrayal, the anger, the stranger's kind words on the beach. All of it felt like pieces of a puzzle I didn't know how to put together. I wanted clarity, but every answer I sought seemed just out of reach, shrouded in uncertainty. Eventually, the sounds of movement outside pulled me from bed. The villa was a flurry of activity as our friends packed up, laughing and joking as they tried to cram souvenirs and wrinkled clothes into suitcases that had seemed so much roomier on the way here. Their energy was infectious, and for a moment, I felt myself slipping into their rhythm, laughing along at someone's struggle to zip a bursting bag. It was a brief reprieve, a reminder of the version of myself I used to be, the version that hadn't yet been shattered. Mark was quiet throughout the morning, hovering near me but careful not to intrude. I could feel his eyes on me, heavy with the weight of words he wasn't saying. Every time I caught his gaze, he looked away, and part of me wondered if he was as afraid of this new reality as I was. We were both walking on eggshells, unsure of where we stood or how to move forward. By the time we boarded the plane, I was exhausted, physically, emotionally, in every possible way. Mark and I ended up sitting side by side, the airline's random seat assignment forcing us into a proximity neither of us seemed ready for. I could feel the tension radiating between us, but neither of us spoke. I kept my eyes fixed on the window, watching the island shrink into the distance until it was nothing more than a speck on the endless blue horizon. It was a fitting metaphor, I thought. The life we had before was slipping further and further away, and I didn't know if we'd ever find our way back to it. The flight was long, and though Mark made a few hesitant attempts at conversation, I shut him down each time with curt, one-word answers. I knew it wasn't fair. I knew I wasn't making this easier on either of us, but I couldn't bring myself to engage. The pain was still too fresh, too raw. So I leaned into the silence, letting it stretch between us like a barrier I wasn't ready to break. When we finally landed, the reality of returning home hit me like a tidal wave. The villa, the beach, the surreal atmosphere of the vacation. It had all been a bubble, a temporary escape from the real world. Now, standing in the arrivals terminal with the dull hum of airport announcements in the background, everything felt sharper, heavier. The weight of what had happened settled over me like a shroud, suffocating in its intensity. The drive home was just as quiet as the flight had been, the city's familiar streets rolling past in a blur. I stared out the window, my thoughts racing, while Mark gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. I could tell he wanted to say something, to break the silence that had grown so thick it was almost tangible, but he didn't. And I didn't either. When we finally pulled into the driveway, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. The house, with its neatly trimmed lawn and warm, welcoming facade, looked the same as it always had, but it no longer felt like home. Stepping inside, I was struck by the overwhelming sense that something had shifted, that the life we'd shared here was now marked by an invisible crack no amount of paint or polish could cover. I set my suitcase down in the entryway, glancing around at the familiar surroundings. The framed photos on the wall, the cozy throw draped over the arm of the couch, the vase of fresh flowers on the kitchen table. It all felt wrong, like it belonged to someone else. I realized with a sinking feeling that I wasn't ready to be here, wasn't ready to face the memories and the questions and the choices waiting for me. "I'll sleep in the guest room," Mark said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, tentative, as if he was afraid of pushing me too far. "I think that's best for now." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Part of me wanted to tell him to leave entirely, to pack a bag and stay somewhere else until I could figure out what I wanted. But another part, quieter but insistent, wasn't ready to let him go. It was a strange contradiction, this simultaneous need for distance and connection, and I hated how uncertain it made me feel. That night, as I lay alone in our bed, I couldn't stop my mind from wandering. I thought about the years we'd spent together, the life we'd built, the man I'd thought I knew. I thought about his betrayal, about the stranger on the beach, about the question James had unknowingly planted in my mind. Could I let go? Not just of the anger and the pain, but of the version of my life I had clung to so tightly? Could I move forward, whether that meant rebuilding with Mark or starting over on my own? The answer didn't come that night. Or the next. In the days that followed, I threw myself into work, into errands, into anything that kept me busy enough to avoid thinking too deeply about the choice looming over me. Mark gave me space, staying out of my way but always nearby. His quiet presence a constant reminder of the decision I had yet to make. Every now and then, I'd catch him looking at me with that same mix of regret and longing, and it would stir something in me, something I wasn't ready to name. One evening, about a week after we returned home, I found myself sitting on the couch, staring at nothing in particular. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt oppressive rather than peaceful. Mark was in the guest room, the door closed, but I knew he wasn't asleep. I could feel the weight of his thoughts pressing against the walls, just as mine were. Before I could stop myself, I stood and walked down the hall, my heart pounding in my chest. I hesitated outside the door, my hand hovering over the handle. Part of me wanted to turn back, to retreat to the safety of my own solitude, but another part, the part that still loved him despite everything, pushed me forward. Taking a deep breath, I knocked softly. "Come in," he said, his voice muffled but unmistakably hopeful. I opened the door to find him sitting on the edge of the bed, his shoulders slumped and his head in his hands. He looked up as I entered, his eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. "I can't keep doing this," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I can't keep pretending like everything's fine when it's not." Mark nodded slowly, his expression a mix of understanding and resignation. "I know," he said. "And I'm not asking you to. I need you to know that I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. To fix us." His words hung in the air, and for the first time I let myself really consider them. Could we fix this? Could we find a way back to the life we'd had? Or at least something close to it? Or was the damage too great, the betrayal too deep? "I don't have an answer yet," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I think I'm willing to try." Mark's face softened, a flicker of hope breaking through the sadness. "That's all I need," he said. "A chance." It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't forgiveness or closure or anything close to a happily ever after. But it was a beginning, a fragile, tentative step toward something new. And for now that was enough. The days that followed were tentative, like walking across a frozen lake, unsure with each step whether the ice would hold or crack beneath us. Mark and I began talking again, but the conversations were halting, careful, as if too much pressure on the wrong subject might shatter whatever fragile progress we were making. It was strange to be rebuilding with someone I had shared so much with before. The intimacy of our old life, our private jokes, the way we could communicate with just a glance, felt distant, like it belonged to another version of us, one that no longer existed. For weeks we lived in this in-between space. Mark stayed in the guest room, and though we shared the same house, there was still a chasm between us. I could see how hard he was trying, in his small, unobtrusive ways. He made dinner most nights, leaving a plate for me even if I wasn't hungry. He fixed the squeaky cabinet in the kitchen that had been annoying me for months. He didn't push me, didn't try to force conversations we weren't ready to have. But every now and then when he thought I wasn't looking, I'd catch him watching me with an expression so raw and vulnerable it made my chest ache. It wasn't easy for me either. Forgiveness felt like an impossible mountain to climb, and I wasn't even sure if I wanted to reach the summit. Every time I thought I was making progress, something would pull me back. A stray thought, a flash of memory, the ghost of his betrayal haunting me at the most unexpected moments. It wasn't just the act itself that hurt. It was the breaking of trust, the knowledge that the person I had built my life around was capable of such a devastating choice. One night I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to quiet the storm of thoughts swirling in my mind. I thought about the years we'd spent together, about the man Mark had been when we first met, the way he used to make me laugh, the way he'd looked at me like I was the only person in the world. Had that been real? Or had it always been an illusion, something I wanted to see because it was easier than facing the truth? The questions were endless and the answers always just out of reach. The turning point came on a quiet Saturday morning. I was sitting in the backyard with a cup of coffee, the crisp autumn air biting gently at my skin. Mark stepped outside hesitantly, holding a mug of his own. For a moment, he stood there awkwardly, as if unsure whether he was welcome. I gestured to the chair across from me, and he sat down, his movements careful, almost timid. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Finally Mark spoke, his voice low and steady. "Do you remember the first trip we took together?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I nodded slowly, the memory surfacing despite the heaviness in my chest. "The cabin by the lake," I said. "You got us lost for 2 hours on the way there." He smiled faintly, a touch of warmth breaking through the sadness in his eyes. "And you spent the entire drive teasing me about my terrible sense of direction." I couldn't help but smile at the memory. It felt like a lifetime ago, a different era of our lives. "We finally found it just before sunset," I added. "And the view was so perfect it almost made getting lost worth it." Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That trip was the first time I knew I wanted to spend the rest of my life with you," he said quietly. "I've never felt more at peace than I did that weekend, sitting by the fire with you, talking about everything and nothing." His words hit me harder than I expected, stirring a mixture of emotions I wasn't ready to confront. Part of me wanted to push him away, to remind him that his actions had shattered the life we'd built together. But another part, quieter and more vulnerable, wanted to believe him, to believe that somewhere beneath the pain and betrayal, there was still something worth saving. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Mark met my gaze, his eyes steady and filled with a raw honesty I hadn't seen in weeks. "Because I need you to know that I haven't forgotten who we were. And I don't want to lose that, Anna. I don't want to lose you." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I looked away, my chest tight with conflicting emotions. I wanted to believe him, to believe that he was as committed to rebuilding as he claimed to be. But trust didn't come easily anymore, and I wasn't sure if I could let myself hope again. "I don't know if we can get back to that," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can." Mark nodded slowly, his expression a mix of sadness and understanding. "I know," he said, "but I'm not going to stop trying, even if it takes the rest of my life." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something other than anger or pain. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. A tiny crack in the wall I'd built around myself, a glimmer of possibility. As the weeks turned into months, that glimmer grew. Mark continued to show up, not just in the big dramatic ways, but in the quiet everyday moments that mattered most. He didn't push me for forgiveness or try to rush the process. Instead, he focused on being present, on proving through his actions that he was willing to do the hard work of rebuilding what he had broken. And slowly, cautiously, I began to let him in. It wasn't a straight path. There were setbacks, days when the pain felt as fresh as the moment I'd first heard his confession. There were nights when I lashed out, unable to contain the anger simmering beneath the surface. But Mark didn't falter. He listened, he apologized, and he stayed. Eventually, I found myself beginning to believe him. Not completely, not yet, but enough to take the first tentative steps toward rebuilding. It was a fragile, uncertain process, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were moving forward instead of standing still. There were no guarantees, no promises that everything would return to the way it had been before. But as we sat together on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized something important. Healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about finding a way to live with it, to carry the scars without letting them define you. And maybe, just maybe, that was something we could do together. The process of moving forward was slow, uneven, and marked by a series of small, fragile steps. At times, it felt like we were walking a tightrope, carefully balancing between what had been lost and what might still be possible. Trust, I had come to realize, wasn't something that could be given freely anymore. It had to be earned bit by bit through actions rather than words. And Mark seemed to understand that. He didn't try to push me or rush me into forgiving him. Instead, he focused on simply being there, present and steady, even when the weight of my anger or sadness threatened to push him away. I started noticing the little things first. How he would check in on me during the day, not with elaborate gestures but with quiet consistency. A text asking if I wanted coffee. A call just to hear my voice. At night, when he thought I was asleep, I'd hear him moving through the house, fixing small things he'd neglected before. A loose hinge, a broken light switch, the crack in the baseboard he'd always promised to get to. It was as if he was trying to repair not just the house but the foundation of our relationship itself. I couldn't pretend it was easy. There were days when the sight of him still brought the betrayal crashing back with brutal clarity. Days when the hurt was so raw that I couldn't even look at him without feeling like I might shatter. I hated those moments, hated the weakness they made me feel, but I couldn't escape them. They were part of the process, a reminder that healing wasn't linear, that there would always be setbacks even as we moved forward. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, Mark broke the silence that had settled between us. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice cautious, as if he were testing the waters. Maybe we could talk to someone. A counselor, I mean. Together." I set down my fork, the suggestion catching me off guard. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. The idea of sharing the most vulnerable, painful parts of our relationship with a stranger felt overwhelming, even terrifying. But at the same time, I couldn't deny that we needed help. As much as I wanted to believe we could navigate this on our own, the cracks in our foundation were too deep to patch with willpower alone. "Okay," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. "We can try." Mark nodded, relief flickering across his face. "I'll find someone," he said. "A good one. Someone who can really help us." True to his word, he did the research, finding a counselor who specialized in couples navigating infidelity. Our first session was awkward, to say the least. Sitting in a small, brightly lit room with a stranger asking probing questions about the most painful parts of our lives was more than uncomfortable. It was excruciating. But as the weeks went on, something started to shift. The sessions forced us to confront things we'd been avoiding for years, long before Mark's betrayal. We talked about the small resentments that had built up over time, the ways we had taken each other for granted without even realizing it. It wasn't just about what had happened that night. It was about everything that had led up to it, every crack in our relationship that we'd ignored until it became a chasm. For the first time, I began to see Mark not just as the man who had hurt me, but as a flawed, complicated person who was struggling in his own way. That didn't excuse what he had done. Nothing ever could. But it made me realize that healing wasn't just about punishing him or making him suffer for his mistakes. It was about figuring out whether we could build something stronger, something more honest, out of the rubble of what had been broken. Outside of counseling, life slowly began to take on a new rhythm. We started spending more time together, not out of obligation but because we genuinely wanted to. At first, it was small things. Sharing a cup of coffee in the morning, going for a walk in the park, watching a movie together on the couch. Those moments felt tentative, almost fragile, but they were a start. And over time they began to add up, forming a new kind of connection that was different from what we'd had before. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't always easy, but it was real. One night, months after that first painful confession, Mark surprised me with a letter. He handed it to me after dinner, his hands trembling slightly as he placed the envelope in front of me. "I wrote this for you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I needed to put it into words." I opened the letter slowly, my heart pounding as I unfolded the paper. The handwriting was familiar, a little uneven in places, as if he'd struggled to keep his thoughts steady. As I read, tears filled my eyes. The letter wasn't perfect, far from it. It was raw and messy, filled with apologies and reflections and admissions of guilt. But it was also honest, painfully so. He talked about the fear and insecurity that had led him to that fateful night, about the shame he felt every time he looked at me and saw the hurt in my eyes. He wrote about the love he still had for me, the love he hoped could somehow be enough to carry us through. When I finished reading, I looked up at him, my vision blurred by tears. For the first time in what felt like forever, I saw him not just as the man who had betrayed me, but as the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. He was still flawed, still imperfect, but he was trying. And in that moment I realized that I was too. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget," I said softly, my voice trembling. "But I think I'm starting to forgive." Mark reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "That's all I could ever hope for," he said, his voice thick with emotion. It wasn't a perfect ending. There were still days when the pain resurfaced, when the memories threatened to pull me under. But there were also days when the love between us felt stronger than it had in years, when I could see the man he was becoming and feel hope for the future we might still have together. Healing, I realized, wasn't about erasing the past, it was about finding a way to live with it, to let it shape us without defining us. And as we sat there, our hands entwined, I knew we were on that path, together. As the months turned into a year, our life together began to feel less like a battleground and more like familiar territory, albeit with a few scars. Trust, while not completely restored, was beginning to rebuild itself in the quiet moments. It was no grand gesture or sudden realization that turned the tide, but a series of small, consistent actions that reminded me why I had fallen in love with Mark in the first place. He became more present than he had ever been, not just in our relationship but in his own life. The counseling sessions had forced both of us to confront uncomfortable truths, not only about what had happened, but about who we were and how we had allowed our connection to fray in the years leading up to that night. For me, it meant acknowledging the ways I had withdrawn from him, the moments I had chosen work or distractions over intimacy. For Mark, it was a reckoning with his own insecurities, his tendency to suppress feelings until they festered into something destructive. These weren't easy conversations, and they often left us drained, but they also left us clearer about what we wanted moving forward. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, Mark turned to me with a question that caught me off guard. "Do you want to go back to that lake? The cabin where we had our first trip together?" His voice was hesitant, like he wasn't sure how I'd react. I thought about it for a moment. That place had always held such a pure, untouched memory of us. A time before the weight of life and responsibility had dulled the edges of our love. Part of me was afraid to return, afraid it might highlight how much had changed. But another part, a growing part, wanted to reclaim it, to create something new in a place that had once been so sacred to us. "Okay," I said, finally meeting his gaze. "Let's go." The drive to the cabin was quiet, but not in the tense way it had been after we'd returned from the trip where everything fell apart. This was a softer silence, one that felt more like reflection than avoidance. Mark reached over to take my hand at one point, and though the gesture was small, it filled me with a warmth I hadn't expected. When we arrived, the sight of the cabin hit me with a wave of nostalgia. It looked almost exactly as I remembered. Its wooden beams weathered but sturdy, the small porch overlooking the still waters of the lake. As we unpacked, I noticed Mark stealing glances at me, as if he were searching for signs of how I was feeling. I gave him a small smile, letting him know I was okay, and his shoulders relaxed just slightly. That first evening we sat by the fire the same way we had all those years ago. Mark brought out a bottle of wine, and for the first time in what felt like forever we laughed together. Not the forced, awkward laughter of people trying too hard, but the easy, unguarded kind that comes when you're completely at ease with someone. It felt like a bridge, spanning the distance that had existed between us for so long. The next morning, as the sun rose over the lake, Mark suggested we go out on the small rowboat that came with the cabin. I hesitated at first, remembering how clumsy and ridiculous we'd been the last time we tried it, but his enthusiasm was infectious. We ended up spending hours on the water, the boat swaying gently beneath us as we talked about everything and nothing. It was one of those rare, perfect moments where the rest of the world faded away, and for the first time in over a year, I felt something close to peace. That trip didn't erase the past. It didn't magically fix everything or make the pain of what had happened disappear. But it gave us something we desperately needed: hope. Hope that we could build something new, something stronger, out of the ashes of what had been. It reminded me that love, real love, isn't about perfection. It's about resilience. It's about choosing each other, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. When we returned home, things weren't magically perfect, but they were better. The tension that had hung over us for so long had started to lift, replaced by a tentative sense of possibility. We continued going to counseling, not because we were still in crisis, but because we wanted to keep growing, to keep learning how to be better for each other. It wasn't always easy, but it felt worth it. There were still moments when the memory of his betrayal would surface, unbidden and unwelcome. A certain song, a passing comment, even a stray thought could bring it all rushing back, sharp and painful. But each time Mark was there, patient and unwavering. He never dismissed my feelings or tried to rush me through them. Instead, he held space for them, letting me process at my own pace. And slowly, those moments became less frequent, less consuming. One night, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mark reached for my hand. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" I asked, genuinely curious. "For giving me another chance," he said. "For believing we could be something again." I squeezed his hand, my heart full of emotions I couldn't quite name. "You gave me another chance too," I said softly. "A chance to see that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real." In that moment, I realized that while the scars of what had happened would always be a part of us, they didn't define us. They were just one chapter in a much larger story, one we were still writing together. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to turn the page. In the years that followed, our relationship grew into something neither of us could have imagined during those first painful weeks after Mark's confession. It wasn't a fairy tale, not by any stretch of the imagination. There were still moments of doubt, moments when old wounds threatened to reopen, but those moments became less frequent as time went on. We learned to recognize them for what they were: echoes of the past, not indicators of the present. What emerged from the wreckage of our marriage wasn't a return to what we had been before. Instead, it was something new, something messier, more honest, and ultimately more resilient. We had both been forced to confront not only the cracks in our relationship but the flaws within ourselves, and in doing so we became better. Not just as a couple but as individuals. The process of rebuilding brought us closer than we had ever been. We learned to communicate in ways we never had before, to talk openly about our fears, our needs, and our vulnerabilities. The walls we had once built around ourselves came down, brick by brick, replaced by a mutual understanding that love wasn't about avoiding pain, but about choosing to face it together. Mark didn't just earn back my trust, he earned my admiration. He became a man who didn't shy away from hard truths, who faced his mistakes with humility and a commitment to doing better. And I, in turn, learned to let go of my need for perfection, to embrace the imperfections in both of us as part of what made our love real. One evening, years later, we returned to the lake. It was our anniversary, and we decided to spend it at the cabin where so much had changed for us. Sitting by the fire, with the same bottle of wine we had shared on our first trip, Mark reached for my hand. "You know," he said, his voice warm and steady, "I still think about that night I told you, about how close I came to losing you." I looked at him, my heart full, and for the first time, the memory didn't sting the way it once had. "But you didn't," I said softly. "We didn't." He smiled, his eyes meeting mine with a depth of love and gratitude that needed no words. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Not just with him, but with myself, with the choices we had made, and with the life we had built from the rubble. As we sat there, the firelight flickering between us, I realized that while our story hadn't unfolded the way I had once imagined, it had become something far more profound. It was a story of mistakes and forgiveness, of breaking and rebuilding, of finding strength in the face of heartbreak. And most importantly, It was a story that was still being written one imperfect, beautiful day at a time.